This is not the first time I've worn Civil War garb. In fact, my very first hike into history, my father and I, on a bit of a challenge, dressed in Civil War uniforms, carried Civil War equipment on what was supposed to be a 9-mile hike. We made it maybe 3 miles in before the pain was so bad we had to stop and to get a car to get us out. And that was our first hike into history. Let's hope this one goes just a little bit better. The first thing I thought on seeing Civil War garb was these shoes are going to be a killer. And surprisingly, they're really not. They look like the most uncomfortable things out there. They have no padding. They're basically just rough pieces of hide with some laces. But as far as actual walking, in the miles that I've done, both now and in the past, they really are not something that crops up. Now, one thing I do want to point out about the shoes is that all that changes if you get them wet. If you get them wet and they dry, they become even stiffer, harder to manage, and they start bordering on incredible uncomfortableness. One thing to talk about is how the American Civil War is really the first industrialized war. And you see that in the equipment and the uniforms that especially a Union soldier is wearing and carrying. This is on the tail end of the Napoleonic era. And take a look at paintings of Napoleonic uniforms, and you very quickly realize they're very elaborate, a lot of braid. One thing they don't strike you as is very reproducible on a mass scale. Well, here you have, for the first real time, giant armies going into battle, needing equipment quickly. So you start to get uniforms like the one I'm wearing, which is got its fair share of gold buttons and brass hardware, but at the same time, this is not the uniform of, say, a Napoleonic hussar. This is the uniform of the industrial age, something that could be reproduced in a mill quickly and pumped out to the battlefield. And that applies to everything from the kepi on my head all the way down to the brogans on my feet. One of my favorite parts of any hike into history is what you sound like on the march. The rustle of leather, the sound of tin kind of bumping against your gear, the rattle of brass fittings. The sound of history is something that you can't really reproduce in your imagination until you've heard it, and it's something you don't get from hiking in modern gear. It's just this beautiful sound, this tinkling, clanking sound that really, between time periods, doesn't seem to differ that much, whether you're a crusading knight or a Union soldier. You got those same kind of marching sounds. It's very interesting. So one of the things I didn't realize on that long ago hike into history with my father was it actually matters in what order you put on everything that hangs off your body as a Civil War soldier. And the primary reason it matters is because when you want to drink of water, you need to be able to reach down, grab your canteen, and be able to get a drink without the strap being held down by 3 or 4 other straps, which, if you're on the march, you can't really stop and take everything off and reposition it. So the order in which you put things in matters. The very first thing that actually goes on is the cartridge belt, where I keep the loads for my rifle. That is actually pinned in place by my belt that goes actually around the chest strap and kind of pins the cartridge belt in place. The next thing I actually put on is the backpack, the soldier's pack. And finally, I put 2 more pieces of gear on, the haversack, which carries my food. And then finally, on top of the haversack goes my canteen, which means that my food and my water is most readily accessible. To load this rifle is not as simple as adding a bullet. First, we reach for our cartridge. Our cartridge is actually in a piece of paper. What we do, this piece of paper has the bullet and the gunpowder. You bite off the end. We pour the gunpowder in the barrel with the bullet and the paper. Then we use the ramrod to tap it down. And we're still not done. In a small pouch, I have what is called a percussion cap. And if you're thinking like a cap gun, you're not far wrong. It's the same principle. It's a little piece of brass that actually has a combustible material. It goes on the nipple of the gun. And now I can fire. There are stories and accounts from Civil War battles of recruits forgetting a step, never putting on a percussion cap, leaving the ramrod in the barrel, so when they fired, it flew out like an arrow. And there are stories of recruits simply loading and loading and loading, but never discharging their weapon, just forgetting to fire until 4, 5, 6 rounds were rammed home in the barrel, and when they finally pulled the trigger, the barrel exploded. One aspect of battle that no one in the Civil War looked forward to was getting into close quarters where you don't have time to load, and you don't have the space, and you have to turn your rifled musket into a spear. And you did that by attaching something called a bayonet. Now with the bayonet attached to this rifle, it's now a spear. And it's deadly in my hands as long as you're within arm's reach. Now, curiously enough, during the Civil War, you don't read about many wounds from bayonet. In fact, it was remarked upon even at the time. Soldiers didn't like to use it. There was a stigma to using the bayonet. It was seen as brutal, if you will. So a lot of soldiers hardly ever used the bayonet as it was intended. In fact, many soldiers used it for other purposes, like, for instance, squaring away their tent, using it as basically a giant utility knife or a spit to hold food over a fire. Anything but what was it originally intended for. Of course, there's more to this equipment than fighting. I'm also carrying on me what I need to survive on the march as far as food and shelter. Now, this is marching gear, so heavier items, more permanent items like, say, walled tents, those would be coming along on a pack train or a wagon train. Right now, I'm in what can I carry as an infantryman without essentially being so weighed down that I'll lose my effectiveness to fight. So let's take a look at what's in our haversacks and what's in our packs. So the order has been given to fall out, to take, say, a 15-minute break from the march. And what I've done is I've taken off my pack, my canteen, and my haversack. The canteen is familiar, I'm sure, to everyone. It's just made of tin, lined in beeswax, covered with a kind of coarse jean material. Really hasn't changed much except in shape since Roman times. What we have here is called a haversack. Union haversacks were tarred like this one to give them a measure of weatherproofing. Confederate haversacks usually were not. What they really are, they're really just your common rucksack. And what the haversack was intended for was essentially food on the march, your rations went in your haversack. One thing you would need in your haversack is one kind of protein. The most common form of marching protein was something called salt pork. And salt pork is a hunk of pork that's essentially been so impregnated with salt that you have essentially dried it out and made it so it is very resistant to spoilage. So it can last for quite a while without being, say, refrigerated or eaten. The thing about salt pork is you can't eat it as it is. You can't cook it as it is. You have to get all that salt out. When I've carried salt pork on previous marches, I've had to go down to like a creek and simply wash it in the creek, soak it in the creek, just to try to get the salt out. And I was only marginally successful, and that's all that most Civil War soldiers ever were. It was not an appetizing protein. Even when you finally got it cut up and kind of fried up like bacon. One of the benefits to having bacon or salt pork that you're frying up is that the grease can give flavor to something else, something that desperately needs it. Something like, hardtack. Hardtack is and has been a staple of the diet of a soldier since Greek times, if not before. It is a staple because it's so simple. It's so simple to make. It's so simple to carry. Literally, it is essentially a perfect marching food because it lasts forever. If only it actually tasted like anything but cardboard. Hardtack. Flour and water. Baked and baked and baked and baked. That is hardtack. And in one shape or another, soldiers have been carrying it for thousands of years, and the Civil War was no exception. Another thing I have in my haversack is actually some tinware, just in case I stop somewhere where someone does get a chance to fire up a cook fire and have a stew or something. This is actually, if you can tell, it has this interesting curved shape. It's because this is actually a canteen that's been cut in half, and now it's being used as a plate. Sometimes, even in an industrialized army, you're having to make do with what you can, hence a canteen plate. Now, a Union soldier would also have coffee beans in his haversack, and they would take the lug end of a bayonet or a butt of a knife, grind up the coffee beans, and then pour hot water over them, and that was coffee, grounds and all. So one thing that's in my pack is something that was incredibly common as far as a way to pass the time, and that is Civil War era playing cards. Portable, lightweight, an easy way to pass the time, and you have almost an infinite amount of games you could play to just pass the time with a pair of playing cards. Now, oddly enough, this is also probably the item that is most discarded by soldiers going into battle. It has nothing to do with the weight. There was almost an embarrassment of being found dead or wounded with a pack of playing cards on you, because playing cards were used for gambling. There was kind of a stigma to it, and the embarrassment was, someone's going to tell your mother or your father that you were wounded or killed on the field of battle and you had playing cards on you. You were gambling. Now, hygiene, believe it or not, became increasingly important to Civil War soldiers. There was starting to get to be a kind of understanding that cleanliness led to healthiness, although that was kind of rudimentary at best. So one thing I have is I do have some toothpaste powder. So it's basically just a tin with some powder to essentially brush my teeth. I also have some shaving soaps so I can maintain these lovely mutton chops. I need some shaving soap. I'm also carrying, along those lines, a cup, a brush, so I can get the shaving soap on here. And finally, towards that end, I have a tin where I'm keeping various bits of hygiene. And of course, I would need a straight razor to maintain, again, this lovely facial hair. One of my favorite pieces is this little tin box, which is not really just a tin box. Inside is a candle and a holder for the candle. And this actually serves as a reflector. So at night, I'd light the candle and the light would bounce off the sides, and I would have essentially a nice little night light to write letters home or to play cards by. I've carried gear from all different kinds of periods. It feels to me that the Civil War gear, the Civil War period, there's more room for sentimentality and emotion in what a soldier is carrying. Almost everything in this pack is not essentially something that is necessary for battle. When I'm a Roman, I'm not really carrying much that's not directly related to me going into battle. As a World War II soldier, dropping into Normandy as a paratrooper, I'm not carrying just a whole lot of sentimental stuff. Whereas the Civil War soldier, it feels like I'm carrying my home around with me in my pack, which explains a lot about why my back and shoulders hurt so bad when you're marching as a Civil War soldier, is you are carrying your home around on your back. There is something romantic about the American Civil War, and it has appealed to Americans ever since the closing days. The amount of films, books, television series about the American Civil War are just legion. There's something about it that grasps us and doesn't let go. And I think some of it is, perhaps unlike being a Roman centurion or a Spartan, or even maybe a paratrooper during World War II, almost anyone can imagine themselves in the brogans of a Civil War soldier. When you put this stuff on, you don't feel that you would have to have been a different person to exist with this clothing and this equipment. And that's what I'm coming away with. The pack still hurt, but I'm still coming away with this idea that there's a romanticism to immersing yourself in this era. There's a sentimentality. It's hard to explain, but it's there. And you see it in something as simple as having playing cards in your pack. But it's an immersion that is worth the time and the effort. It's a walk that I'm not going to forget. Until next time, this is Heath the History Guy, signing off.